The Theology of Jordan Peterson. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is a Canadian psychologist, author, and public speaker known for his views on psychology, religion, culture, and politics. A former professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, he rose to international prominence in the late 2010s through his critiques of political correctness and his defense of traditional values and free speech. His work often blends Jungian psychology, biblical interpretation, and philosophical commentary, and has been both widely influential and highly controversial. Peterson is infamous for the obscurity of his statements on God and religion. In this series, I want to explore the theology of Dr. Peterson by looking at several examples of him discussing his ideas, so that we can better understand his views on God, religion, and spirituality. Chapter 1. Where do you stand in terms of your spirituality? POGG Canada, which stands for Peace, Order, and Good Government, is a Canadian public policy group that advocates for free speech and highlights issues that are not widely discussed. On November 19, 2016, in Ottawa, they presented then-Professor Dr. Jordan B. Peterson with the Canadian Values Award. Following his speech, there was a brief Q&A session. What follows is one question he received about his spirituality.
Where do you stand in terms of your spirituality?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. Watch my videos. And that's the best I can do. So if you watch, I have a course online called Maps of Meaning. There's 40 hours of lectures, and that explains it. And I cannot simplify that. Now, I can simplify it to some degree. I guess I'm wrong. I can simplify it to some degree.
Peterson's instinct is to avoid the question, initially deflecting by telling the questioner to study his lectures and insisting the topic is too complex to summarize. This is a classic move found in authoritarian and esotericist rhetoric, claiming that the truth is too deep for direct answers and demanding that the seeker wade through hours of sprawling material in hopes of piecing it together. But he quickly realizes this won't land well in the context of a live audience, so he contradicts himself and proceeds to offer a clear summary of his views. This undercuts his usual excuse and demonstrates that he is capable of articulating his position in under 10 minutes. His default strategy of assigning homework appears less like a commitment to intellectual rigor and more like a defensive maneuver to avoid clarity and accountability. The Logos.
So there's a principle at the heart of Western civilization, and it's older than Christianity, and it's older than Judaism, although both Judaism and Christianity developed it to a great degree. The Jews especially with the prophetic tradition, and the Christians more with the metaphysical idea of the Word. And so the idea is, it's the idea of the Logos. And the Logos is also the root word of logic. But Logos means something like coherent, interpersonal communication of the truth. And from an archetypal perspective, it's the action of the Logos that extracts order from chaos. And that's really the meaning of the first chapter of Genesis.
There is no credible historical or theological basis for claiming that ancient myths, from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Israel, and Christianity, share a unified concept of the Logos as truthful speech generating order from chaos. Logos is a Greek philosophical term, not an ancient universal principle. And imposing it retroactively across disparate traditions is projection, not interpretation. Peterson's definition is also internally contradictory. He presents the Logos as both a universal human principle and a uniquely Western inheritance, especially as realized in Christian thought. But it cannot be both. Moreover, the idea that truthful speech is what makes the world habitable is romanticized rhetoric, not supported by reality. Countless species create complex, adaptive order without language or abstract reasoning. This is not careful scholarship, but mythologizing, a speculative, esoteric narrative dressed up as ancient truth.
And it's an old idea. It's embedded in Mid-Eastern mythologies that might be, we don't know, tens to hundreds of thousands of years old.
There is no evidence for this claim. Writing itself is only about 5,500 years old. Ideas change, adapt, and evolve. They do not remain fixed across millennia, and it's nearly impossible to know about any ideas prior to written culture. The belief that a single core principle underlies all religious traditions and stretches back into prehistoric times is a hallmark of perennialism, an ahistorical, esoteric ideology most famously developed by anti-modernist thinkers like René Guénon and Julius Evola, which claims there once existed a universal prisca theologia, a pure ancient wisdom that has since fragmented but remains foundational to our culture. In reality, no such unbroken core exists. Religious ideas are diverse, context-dependent, evolving, and often in conflict. Peterson asserts his concept of the logos as this ancient principle and projects it backwards into mythic history, citing the Horus cycle, the Enuma Elish, and Genesis 1 as proof texts. But religious scholars, while noting some influence and parallels, reject the notion that these myths can be meaningfully identified with the logos theology of John 1. That connection is a retroactive Christian syncretism, not a discovery. It's not history, it's ideological reconstruction disguised as mythic continuity.
And the idea is that what being is a chaotic admixture it's a chaotic admixture. And the way that human beings interact with that and make it habitable is through articulated truth. We make order with articulated truth, and then we inhabit the order. And the order is the negotiated social agreement that we've all come to, right, so that we can live among each other without tearing each other to shreds, which is basically what chimpanzees do to one another. So we have to negotiate the social order, and we do that through articulated speech.
This is a deeply anxious and conservative framing of human existence. The world is chaotic and dangerous, and without a strict speech-based order, we are on the brink of collapse. It assumes that chaos is our natural state, and that civilization is a fragile construct barely holding back savagery. This vision has long served as the emotional backbone of reactionary thought. The idea that without traditional hierarchy or moral rigidity, we will descend into barbarism. The reference to chimpanzees, positioned as the violent alternative to our carefully negotiated social order, is not neutral. It carries an unsettling racial subtext, echoing colonial and pseudoscientific tropes that liken human disorder, implicitly in marginalized communities, to animalistic chaos. Whether intentional or not, this kind of comparison has historically been used to justify oppressive systems of control under the guise of preserving order.
Speech. And then what Christianity did was take that proposition, which was derived partly from Mesopotamia, partly from Judaism, partly from Egypt, and turn it into what would you call it, a symbolic doctrine. And so they took the figure of Christ, who's the ideal man from an archetypal psychological perspective, just means the ideal man. Right? So it's an image of the ideal. The ideal is the Word made flesh, and what that means is the instantiation of the logos in the body so that it's acted out in the world. It's the fundamental proposition of Western culture, and we've lost it, and we will not survive without it.
This is not a Christian theological claim. It's a Jungian psychologization of Christianity, presented as if it were its deepest truth. Peterson's assertion that Christ is the ideal man is historically and theologically false. In Orthodox Christian belief, Christ is not merely an archetype, but the unique incarnate second person of the Trinity, not a role model we all aspire to embody, but the one who does what no one else can, live sinlessly, die for humanity's sins, and rise again. The Logos theology of John 1 is not about each of us living out the Logos, but about God becoming flesh in a once-for-all, unrepeatable event. Peterson erases these doctrinal claims and recasts Christianity as a symbolic moral framework. This allows him to draw on Christian language while discarding its content. When he calls this reinterpreted logos the fundamental proposition of Western culture, and warns that we will not survive without it, he is not offering theology or history, but a myth of cultural decline. It is fear-based rhetoric using the threat of collapse to sanctify a personal ideology cloaked in religious terms. Peterson's project is not theology or history. It's symbolic repackaging. He strips Christianity of its doctrinal and historical specificity and reframes it as a system of psychological archetypes. Christ becomes the ideal man, not the incarnate Son of God. The gospel becomes a metaphor for personal meaning, not divine revelation. This allows Peterson to invoke Christian imagery while sidestepping theological commitment. It gives him rhetorical flexibility. He borrows sacred language to lend gravity to his views while removing its actual doctrinal content. What remains is a Christianity emptied of belief and filled with moral symbolism, retooled to carry his ideological message under the guise of psychological truth.
And that's why people like Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, when they were talking to the Russians, they said, look, the proper course of Russian development is to return to Russian Orthodoxy and to develop it forward into the future. A very difficult thing to do.
This invocation of Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky reflects Peterson's broader anti-communist anxiety, and his underlying endorsement of religious traditionalism as a bulwark against perceived cultural or moral collapse. The idea that returning to orthodoxy, or any traditional religious framework, is the proper course of development positions modernity, secularism, and especially leftist politics as inherently corrosive. It's part of a familiar narrative in which spiritual decline and political disorder are equated, and only return to inherited religious structures can restore order. What is, and what you should do about it.
Because the fundamentalist Christians, particularly, but I would say the Christians in general, can't distinguish between their truth claims and the truth claims of science. And they tend to insist at a philosophical level that the truths that are embedded in mythological structures are of the same type as scientific truth. And they're not. Scientific truths are descriptions of what is, right? Mythological truths, religious truths, are descriptions of being and guidelines to what ought to be. So you could say that there's two things you need to know in the world. One is what is. That's the objective world. What's the objective world? But that's only half of what you need to know. The other half is what you should do about it. And that's the primary existential, existential issue. How to act in the world. Well, religious doctrine is about the world as a place to act. It's not about the world as a place of objects. That's science. And there's no contradiction between the two, except that we don't have the philosophical discrimination to distinguish between them.
Peterson draws a sharp distinction between scientific truths, which describe what is, and religious truths, which describe how we ought to act. But in doing so, he empties Christianity of its core content, reducing doctrines like the Incarnation, the Resurrection, and the Second Coming to mere symbolic archetypes about personal transformation and psychological meaning. This reframing abandons Christianity's historical and theological claims, that God has acted and will act in real tangible history, not just in the human psyche. Ironically, the fundamentalist Peterson critiques are actually closer to historic Christian orthodoxy, which treats these events as objective truths, not metaphors. By repurposing Christianity into a symbolic moral story, Peterson avoids theological commitment while preserving its emotional and cultural weight. This allows him to speak in sacred tones while sidestepping the core question of truth, and yet he still insists that religion grants privileged access to moral knowledge. That assertion, however, rests on philosophical ground he never fully defends. The idea that religion tells us how we ought to act assumes a kind of moral realism, the belief that there are objective, discoverable facts about right and wrong. Peterson claims to honor the fact-value distinction by assigning science the role of describing what is, and religion the role of prescribing what ought to be. But this is not a genuine fact-value distinction. It's a rhetorical maneuver that reintroduces moral authority through the back door, via Jungian archetypes, evolutionary psychology, and mythic symbolism. For David Hume, the point of the fact-value distinction is precisely that there are no moral facts. You cannot logically derive an ought from an is, nor carve out a separate domain of moral truths, immune to empirical scrutiny. Friedrich Nietzsche radicalized this insight, arguing that moral systems, especially religious ones, are not discoveries of truth, but expressions of fear, power, and control. From this perspective, Peterson's appeal to religion and myth as guides to life is not an alternative kind of knowledge. It's a constructed narrative shaped by history and psychology, not by anything absolute or binding. Even if archetypes or evolved tendencies can be described scientifically, they cannot prescribe how we ought to live in any objective way. We are free to choose, free to rebel, and free to reject any system of values. There is no metaphysical authority in religion, only interpretation and frameworks, none of which can diminish our freedom or relieve us of the responsibility to decide how we live. Toward a philosophy of the logos, accounting for what is and what should be.
Now Heidegger started to do that with his analysis of being, but he didn't do that within a Christian framework, but for all intents and purposes at the moment, that's irrelevant. Hume started to do it, Carl Jung, and Carl Jung was a student of Nietzsche, and also Freud. Now Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced back in the late 1800s that God was dead. And when you know that, quote, Nietzsche said God was dead, but what you don't know probably is the context within which he said that in the Gay Science. He said, I paraphrase, God is dead and we have killed it and we will never find enough water to wash away the blood. It wasn't a triumphalist statement on Nietzsche's part. He predicted that millions of people would die in the 20th century as a consequence of the ascendance of communist ideology. He predicted that in like 1880. It's unbelievable. And Dostoevsky knew exactly the same thing. He predicted that in The Devils, in his great book, The Devils. So
Peterson invokes figures like Heidegger, Jung, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky to frame the loss of religious meaning as a civilizational crisis, understood only by a few elite minds. But this lineage is deeply compromised. Heidegger was a Nazi, Jung trafficked in occult and racialized archetypes with fascist undertones, and Nietzsche, though complex, was later co-opted by Nazi ideology. Peterson borrows their language while ignoring their historical baggage, presenting the logos as a universal metaphysical anchor that only he and a select few truly grasp, positioning himself as a kind of esoteric authority, capable of understanding this centering principle unknown by most others. This elitism is reinforced by his rhetoric of cultural collapse, in which communism is hyper-chaos and fascism hyper-order, a false centrism that flattens political history and obscures the violence and instability of fascism. Leftism is not inherently chaotic, nor is fascism truly orderly. The effect is to cast Peterson's logos-centered conservatism as the only sane middle, quietly naturalizing a traditionalist hierarchical worldview as the path to survival.
we have no cornerstone in our culture. We've come unmoored, and we oscillate from the radical right, hyper-order, to the radical left, hyper-chaos. And millions of people die with each turn of the snake, let's say. We have got nothing to keep us centered. And what keeps people centered, whether they know it or not, is the logos. They just don't understand what it means.
Peterson lays the foundation for a classic narrative of cultural crisis. We are unmoored, with no cornerstone, lurching between political extremes and spiraling into chaos. Into this vacuum he inserts the logos, not as one possible interpretation or value system, but as the hidden force that keeps people centered, whether they know it or not. This is a powerful rhetorical move. It frames his preferred worldview as the unrecognized but essential truth, and casts those who disagree as spiritually disoriented or blind. It's also a form of Gnostic elitism. He alone understands the logos, while the rest of us unknowingly depend on it. The effect is to turn a contested philosophical idea into an unquestionable metaphysical anchor, positioning Peterson's symbolic framework not just as insightful, but as civilizationally indispensable.
What it means. Now, Carl Jung elaborated that in great detail in his unbelievably difficult and terrifying works, and did it brilliantly. But Jung is a hard nut to crack, and most people read him, and first they don't understand, and so they quit, and then if they start to understand, then they really quit. So, because the problem, the thing about the philosophy that's instantiated, say, in Jungian psychotherapy, in the Jungian model, is that it requires personal responsibility above all else.
Peterson presents Jung as a kind of mystic sage, unbelievably difficult, terrifying, brilliant, whose work repels the unworthy and rewards only the few who persevere, casting Jungian psychology as an esoteric knowledge system for the initiated. This rhetoric flatters the audience into revering complexity without critically engaging the content, and it lends Peterson himself a quasi-prophetic status as someone who has unlocked and distilled these hidden truths. His emphasis on personal responsibility as the heart of Jung's model is equally vague, an undefined ideal that could mean anything from self-examination to radicalized activism. By leaving it ambiguous, Peterson atomizes ethics, deflecting attention away from systemic or collective issues and onto the individual's moral self-regulation. This makes his message broadly palatable to conservative and reactionary worldviews, while cloaked in the language of depth psychology. His constant invocation of figures like Jung, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky serves to borrow their intellectual authority, while advancing an idiosyncratic and deeply anti-modern ideology under the guise of psychological insight.
And one of the things I figured out a long time ago, so imagine you could give people a choice. Here's your choice, people. On the one hand, your life is meaningless. You're just a speck in a cosmic landscape, and the brief time that you inhabit being is worth nothing. That's one option. And people think, well, that's a terrible option, that's a nihilistic option. How can I tolerate the suffering that's attendant on my life with no countervailing meaning? Perfectly reasonable question. Here's the alternative. Everything you do matters. Everything you do matters. And you have to bear the responsibility for that. Every decision you make determines the destiny of the cosmos. That's meaning. Now, which one do you want?
This is a classic false dichotomy, an all-or-nothing framing that distorts the range of human experience. Peterson presents two extreme options: nihilism, where life is utterly meaningless, or cosmic burden, where every action shapes the destiny of the universe and demands infinite responsibility. But meaning does not require total significance, and existential finitude does not entail nihilism. This binary is designed to exploit anxiety, making both choices seem daunting, and forcing the listener to choose the lesser evil. It postures as profound insight, something Peterson figured out, but it's ultimately a manipulative rhetorical trap. In reality, meaning can be found in connection, care, creativity, curiosity, none of which require the belief that everything one does matters. It's a false choice between despair and radicalization, and we are free to reject both.
Well, that's easy. People will take meaninglessness and nihilism over that burden any day. I wish I had a meaningful life. It's like, really? Do you? Really? Really? You're prepared to bear, let's say, infinite responsibility for each of your choices, because that's meaningful. So no, people will shrink away from that. And no wonder they shrink away from that, like animals shrink away from a fire, and it's perfectly understandable, but we don't get to shrink away from that anymore. Not without their being held to pay.
Peterson's false dichotomy is no longer just a theoretical choice. It becomes a looming, unavoidable judgment. By insisting that most people would rather embrace meaninglessness than face the unbearable weight of infinite responsibility, he frames nihilism as a cowardly escape and meaning as an almost divine burden. Then he escalates the emotional pressure. We don't get to shrink from this burden without there being hell to pay. The implication is clear. If you reject his model of meaning, you invite suffering, disorder, and collapse. It's a deeply manipulative move using fear and shame to corner the listener into submission. The original choice was already a false one, but now it's reframed as a moral failing with dire consequences. Rather than offering insight, Peterson wields existential anxiety to enforce his ideology, demanding assent not through reason, but through fear. Analysis. Peterson believes that there is an ancient, universal idea at the heart of Western civilization, the Logos, without which our society is destined for collapse. He frames this Logos as the divine principle of truthful speech that brings order out of chaos, a metaphysical force embedded in the structure of being itself. According to him, this idea emerged in ancient mythologies, developed in Egypt through the Horus cycle, in Mesopotamia in the Enuma Elish, and in Israel through Genesis 1, and reached its pinnacle in the prologue to the Gospel of John, where the Logos is made flesh in Christ. However, Peterson reinterprets this doctrine psychologically rather than theologically. Christ is not the divine second person of the Trinity, but the archetype of the ideal man, one who embodies Logos by acting truthfully, responsibly, and courageously in the face of chaos. Peterson claims that each of us must also live out the Logos, taking on infinite personal responsibility for shaping the world through our speech and choices. This, for him, is the only alternative to nihilism. He presents this as the foundation of meaning in life and the necessary spiritual and moral center of civilization. Without it, he warns, we are unmoored and doomed to swing between political extremes, hyper-order, fascism, and hyper-chaos, communism, resulting in mass death and civilizational collapse. He sees this Logos-centered worldview not only as spiritually true, but as existentially necessary, the only stable middle ground that can hold society together. Peterson's worldview appears heavily influenced by perennialist and anti-modernist thinkers like René Guénon and Julius Evola, who believed in a lost ancient wisdom, Prisca Theologia, that must be recovered to restore cultural order. He draws from Jungian psychology, recasting religious doctrines as archetypal myths, and relies on esoteric traditionalism, implying that only a select few, like himself, truly grasp the deep truths of existence. His rhetorical techniques are layered and strategic. He loads his arguments with unexamined assumptions, presents baseless speculations, like myths from 10,000s of years ago, as fact, and engages in syncretism, flattening distinct traditions into a single, oversimplified narrative of the Logos. He dehistoricizes Christianity, transforming it into symbolic psychology, and frames dissent as dangerous by provoking anxiety, warning of societal collapse or hell to pay. His style is marked by elitism, myth-making, and false dichotomies, such as forcing a choice between nihilism and infinite responsibility. Altogether, these moves create a compelling but deceptive framework that masquerades as wisdom while advancing a rigid, hierarchical, and ideologically loaded vision of meaning and order. Jordan Peterson constructs a worldview that presents itself as intellectually profound and spiritually necessary, but in reality it is ideologically manipulative, historically inaccurate, and philosophically confused. He recast religious traditions, especially Christianity, not as systems of concrete historical claims or theological truths, but as symbolic frameworks for personal meaning, stripped of their specificity and repurposed into psychological myth. He positions himself as a privileged interpreter of these myths, employing elitism, esotericism, and anxiety-driven rhetoric to assert that his interpretation is essential for civilizational survival. His arguments often rely on false dichotomies, unexamined assumptions, and oversimplified syncretism, collapsing complex histories and traditions into a single story about the Logos and cultural decline. Though cloaked in the language of responsibility and order, his message ultimately serves to naturalize a conservative, hierarchical worldview while silencing dissent with fear of collapse. Peterson doesn't offer real understanding. He offers a myth that flatters the disoriented, frightens the unsure, and presents ideology as ancient truth. Next time on The Theology of Jordan Peterson, Chapter 2. People often ask me, do you believe in God? I don't like that question.